Hello, everybody. Welcome to Lunch and Learn January 2026. Um, this is the first Lunch and Learn of the year. Also, Happy New Year to everybody since we haven't talked since November. But I want to thank everybody for joining us as we wait for a couple more minutes for other people to join in. Today certainly should be a great Lunch and Learn as well, coming from the great Mrs. Linda. She is going to teach us some great things about criminal history today. I'm excited for you guys. So just in a couple minutes, she's going to get on and start. So bear with us. Thank you. And I do want to mention the CLE code is 542255. I put in the chat in case you don't see it. You can also email us. I'll be happy to share that with you. Also, we have been approved for on-demand CLE code credit. So if you watch, we have some videos online of the previous Lunch and Learns that we have done for October and November. If you want to watch those and email us that you have watched them, we'll be happy to go ahead and share that code with you so you get that credit. And I think that's all I have. Can't think of much else. Also, yep, and then PowerPoint. If you guys need that PowerPoint, last time I tried to share it in the chat, it was not sharing. Again, go ahead and email us. We'll be happy to share that PowerPoint if you want to follow along. So again, for the CLE code for today, you can go ahead and email us. And then also if you want the PowerPoint, email too, if you're not seeing it in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and try to send the CLE code in the chat again. Hopefully you guys can see. But I think because we're all part of different organizations, it doesn't allow us to see each other's chat all the time. But maybe you will be able to see it this time. We'll see. All right, Linda. I think we're ready for you.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for that fabulous introduction, Devontae. I always appreciate that. Again, we've got the CLE code for this, the prior Lunch and Learns, as well as the prior recordings that everyone can listen to, as Devontae said. I really appreciate, again, his assistance in getting this to the point where we can actually do these again. So much props to him for that. Today is one of those trainings where I'm a little nervous. This is the stuff, not all of these policies, but one particular policy within here on the out-of-state offenses. It's making me a little nervous because I think that's getting to be more and more difficult, and we're having more and more issues getting information and figuring out who's responsible for what. So when we get to that part, it might seem very high level, and it is because this is a broader recorded training for it. But as you know, I'm always available. The whole MSG staff, always available for you to talk to us about those individual situations that are having trouble. So if this feels a lot more high level than you were expecting, there's an intent there. But in the meantime, let's get rolling. So today we're doing the remaining criminal history policies that are contained within section 2B.3 through 2B.7. Normally we're going to be getting into a new guideline year, but that's not until August. So these are still going to be policies that are going to be maintained, that are going to be used depending on what the offense date is. So we put out our guidelines every year on August 1st, and they remain in practice through July 31st of the following year. The exception to that rule was in 2021 when they went out on September 15th. So that's always a date that you want to be careful of. But that's what date we're looking at when we say the current offense is we're looking for the date that the offense occurred. And then that is the date that we use for the guidelines to find everything related to the current offense. But after the Robinette case in 2021, those changes that impacted criminal history back in 2019 were now, based on something called the amelioration doctrine, available to any defendant who had not yet been convicted and sentenced on their offense. And so those 2019 policies are what someone wants to use going all the way back to 1980 when the guidelines went into effect. And one thing that I can tell you is this morning I helped out an agent. There was a stay of adjudication that was revoked, and the worksheet was not, an updated or new worksheet was not ordered. The original worksheet for the stay of adjudication was done in 2014, but the sentence was just done last year, 2025. That was the first time they received an imposed sentence. By not ordering a new worksheet, the judge ended up with an inadvertent departure, because when the agent went in and updated the worksheet, it applied the 2019 policies to the 2014 offense date. So please always be exceptionally careful and ensure that you are giving the court a worksheet that has been reviewed. And if it is not able to be officially reviewed, mostly because it may be missing a conviction plea date and you want us to take a look at it for you, it's an informal review. We're not going to put our name on it, but at least you will have sent it past another set of eyes to take a look to ensure that we don't have those errors coming up. So, where I want to start today is a reminder on the level of sentence, because when we get into talking about the level of sentence for gross misdemeanors and misdemeanors, we have a lot more policies than we do within the level of sentence for a felony. And that's because any felony sentenced to a gross misdemeanor level or a misdemeanor level sentence, that will make that offense now a gross misdemeanor or a misdemeanor. And one thing we have to be really careful of is keeping in mind that when we're looking at those priors, we really do need to look at the prior sentencing date, because of that change in 2023, where it used to be 365 days was the maximum for a gross misdemeanor, and then it changed to 364 days. So that's why we want to be careful and never assume that just because somebody got 365 days, they're a felony, because now that's what a felony is. We need to go back and look at that date. So whenever someone is convicted and sentenced on the offense in Minnesota, it's called giving them an imposed sentence. And that imposed sentence is not whether they went to prison or jail or had their sentence stayed. It's how long that sentence was. And that's found in statute 609.02. And within subdivision 3 and subdivision 4, it tells us what the durations are for a gross misdemeanor or a misdemeanor. So a gross misdemeanor is now, if sentenced after July 1st of 2023, a maximum of 364 days. The misdemeanor duration did not change. It still remains at 1 day to 90 days. But one thing that we have to be careful of, and that's why the level of sentence is so important, is that those gross misdemeanors that receive a sentence of less than 91 days are now going to be considered misdemeanors. So when we get into the misdemeanor section, we're going to be talking about eligible misdemeanors, and you're going to find something very important about gross misdemeanors sentenced to less than their statutory maximum sentence of 364 or 365. When the sentence is imposed, the court pronounces a duration that aligns with statute, and then they can either stay that sentence or it can be executed to jail or to prison. But in Minnesota, we also have the stay of imposition. And when we stay in position of the sentence, what we are staying in that term is giving that person any kind of duration from statute to say, this is the amount of time you will serve. We don't have that when we do a stay of imposition. So without that duration that we can match up to a statute, we have to fall back on the offense level. So whenever we have a sentence that's a stay of imposition, we are looking at what the original offense was. Was it a gross misdemeanor or a misdemeanor? For this training, we're just focusing on those two. Was it a gross misdemeanor or was it a misdemeanor? Because it will stay at that level until it is decayed. And that includes it being revoked. And excuse me, that includes it being successfully completed and dismissed, or not dismissed. Wow, my words are just escaping me today. I'm so sorry. When it is successfully completed, it is deemed a misdemeanor. But that is not for criminal history purposes. That is only for non-criminal or civil purposes, a job application, a housing application, where they can say, no, they have never been convicted of a felony or a gross misdemeanor, or having that reduced is for that reason only. When it comes to calculating criminal history, you want to leave those offenses in at the level of the conviction offense. So we don't do any removal of those or any reducing of those to the misdemeanor after successful completion. And then finally, I'm so sorry. Our furnace went out last night. I'm a little tired, not making excuses, just making an understanding of why my brain is a little schizo today, and I'm really sorry for that. So let's keep going. 2B.3 are the policies that govern misdemeanor and gross misdemeanor offenses. These can be used in criminal history for 10 years. And that 10-year start and end date is the disposition date of the prior to the date the current offense occurs. That's the 10-year range that we apply to all targeted misdemeanors, all non-traffic gross misdemeanors, as well as gross misdemeanor DWI or refusal to test and gross misdemeanor reckless driving. Those DWI and reckless driving offenses are the only traffic type offenses that the commission has deemed eligible for use in criminal history. So gross misdemeanors or misdemeanors driving after cancellation, underage drinking and driving, things like that, those are not going to be eligible. Just the misdemeanor or gross misdemeanor DWIs, refusal to test, or gross reckless driving. And one of the reasons why it's really important to understand that level of sentence and to know that once something receives its sentence or its stay of imposition, that's now the level of offense it is considered to be. As I mentioned when we were looking at that slide on the misdemeanor and gross misdemeanor imposed sentences, if you have a gross misdemeanor that receives an imposed sentence of the misdemeanor level, so 90 days or less, that gross misdemeanor also has to be on the targeted misdemeanor list in order to be included. If it is not, it does not get included at all. So any gross misdemeanor that you're going to include make certain it receives a gross misdemeanor sentence or a stay of imposition. And if it does not, if it gets sentenced as a misdemeanor, make certain it's on the list of eligible targeted misdemeanors. Again, the disposition date is 10 years, and that's, again, whether it started as a gross misdemeanor or a misdemeanor, or it was a felony that was sentenced to a misdemeanor or gross misdemeanor level, and now it is deemed one of those for the purposes of criminal history use. That still takes on the characteristics of a misdemeanor or gross misdemeanor. So that offense will still look at that disposition date plus 10 years to give it whether or not it will be included or not. It takes 4 of these types of priors to make 1 point, and generally speaking, that's the maximum amount of points that someone can get. But a little closer examination of that policy tells us that if the current offense is a felony DWI or a felony CVO or CVH, so criminal vehicular operation or homicide, that if they have those types of priors in their criminal history, there may be the eligibility of additional points. Those can get very complicated, and because they are very infrequent, the ask of you is that when you are working with someone who has a current felony DWI or CVO, CVH, and they have an excessive number of prior misdemeanor or gross misdemeanor DWIs or gross misdemeanor criminal vehicular operation offenses, give us a call. We want to talk through that with you because some of those may be worth 2 units, and we may have considerably more than just that 1 misdemeanor or gross misdemeanor point. But because it happens so infrequently, we want you to focus on that first point and then seek out for assistance if you need help with one of those special circumstances. And again, just to make certain that we understand that everything going on here when you're filling out the electronic worksheet system, don't forget to answer that custody question so that custody calculates correctly. I want to remind you again that you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask any questions, or if you want to send a chat, Devante will be watching for that, and I'm happy to answer any questions at any time that you might have. Our next section of criminal history is 2B.4, which are the juvenile policies. And the juvenile policies are extremely strict on what you can include. We only want to see felony level offenses that were committed after the age of 14. So anything that occurred prior to the age of 14 does not count regardless of what it is. It does not count. So felony level offenses committed on or after the defendant's 14th birthday are eligible provided that they were adjudicated delinquent in juvenile court. And I really want to emphasize that part of this because when we get into the out-of-state criminal history section, that is going to be the number one thing that you're going to look for in those out-of-state juvenile offenses. But for now, felony level offenses committed on or after the 14th birthday that were adjudicated delinquent in juvenile court. And those can be included up until the defendant turns 25. So once their 25th birthday happens, juvenile offenses are no longer eligible. It takes 2 of these types of priors to make 1 point. Within the juvenile and the misdemeanor, gross misdemeanor section, we don't have quarter points or half points or anything like that. We just simply say for the misdemeanor, gross misdemeanor, it takes 4 units to make a point. Here within the juveniles, it takes 2 priors to make a point. And in most of the cases, that's going to be the maximum number of points that they get. However, again, we're going to ask you to reach out to us if the juvenile has an extensive juvenile adjudication record, because they may be eligible for an additional point, which happens if they meet that criteria of felony committed after 14, they're under the age of 25, adjudicated delinquent in juvenile court. But now we add the extra criteria that they have to be presumptive commits on the grid in order to apply that subsequent point policy. Because that doesn't happen, for those policies that just don't happen a lot, I really want you to focus on what does, and knowing what does make that one juvenile point, and then reaching out to us if you think you've got a criminal history that may add to the number of points that they can get. And the other helpful thing with that is make certain that you include everything, because there's a difference between what is eligible to be included and what makes the point. So we never want to see only 4 misdemeanor or gross misdemeanors on the worksheet. We send it back because one of them is incorrect, and it gets replaced with a different one. Everything should have been on the worksheet to start with. All of the juvenile history here should be on the worksheet to start with that meet the criteria. Even though you may only end up giving them 1 point, it is still 2 different things to think about. Everything that's eligible and how many points can I assign for it. So with respect to both misdemeanor, gross misdemeanor, and juvenile, always ensure that you're putting everything into that criminal history that they are eligible to have. The next section in guidelines is section 2B6, or that we're going to talk about, is section 2B6. And that's because section 2B5, which is the out-of-state offense section, I decided to pull that out and put that at the end today so that we could spend time focused on all of the policies. So enhanced offenses. I will tell you that the number one issue with enhanced offenses is who does the enhancing. And that would be found in the complaint. So that would come from the prosecutor. Probation is not responsible for determining what is used to enhance the offense. So it can make it rather cumbersome when the complaint lists everything. And there are important reasons for doing that. However, within that laundry list of priors, 2 of them have to be dealt with if it's, say, a domestic, a violate no contact order. 3 of them have to be dealt with if it's a felony DWI. However many the statute says are required to take this misdemeanor level behavior and elevate it to a felony is found in statute, and then those are taken off of the complaint and dealt with respect to criminal history. So we stick offenses, enhanced offenses, into 2 categories, DWI and non-DWI. But for most of this, it's simply because DWIs have a slightly different rule for subsequent DWIs. So we tend to pull that out and think of that differently than we do our other enhanced offenses. And our trigger for this is anytime we see, that this offense was in violation of 2 or more like offenses in the last 10 years or however many years. That's the indication that we've got this new felony that is based on very much past behavior. So how do we deal with that past behavior in their criminal history? Well, first of all, no matter what is being used to enhance, meaning a targeted misdemeanor, a non-traffic gross misdemeanor, or a DWI that gets used to enhance, custody can always be assigned for those. But what you don't do is take those misdemeanors and gross misdemeanors used to enhance and also include them in criminal history. So here would be where a comment would be very helpful on the worksheet to say, hey, we're placing a custody point on this worksheet because he was on custody for this prior DANCO that was used to enhance this offense, or this prior misdemeanor DWI that was used to enhance this DWI. So that allows you to have the custody without the corresponding prior in criminal history, because we don't want to include those misdemeanor and gross misdemeanor offenses in criminal history. But if felonies are used to enhance, which includes juvenile adjudications for felonies when it's applicable, and I can tell you I know that the domestic statutes say conviction or adjudication of delinquency, adjudicated delinquent, that allows them to use those juvenile offenses to enhance. When those are used, those remain in criminal history. So I think it's really important to have this discussion of what is being used to enhance because of the effect it can have in criminal history. And I see that we had a comment pop up. Devontae, if you don't mind in the chat, I'll take that. I am often seeing the complaint list all of the QDVROs, qualified domestic violence related offenses. And when trying to contact the county attorney for clarification on which ones enhanced, they don't respond timely. That is the unfortunate thing that we are looking at. And this is where it gets really difficult when you have a combination of both misdemeanor and gross misdemeanor and felonies, simply because one of them comes off, one of them stays on. I do think that starting the conversation when you get one of those enhanced offenses, starting that conversation early, there may be something in the plea agreement. I mean, as you can see, I'm stumbling to find an answer because much like out-of-state offenses, it is just a struggle. And it is really a communications issue, that there should be a willing communication between all parties to determine what is the correct way to approach this criminal history. But I will tell you, nowhere in the guidelines does it say who is responsible for making that decision. All it does is tell you what to do once that decision has been made. So it is going to be a little bit difficult, and there will have to be some pushing to get that answer. And I don't think it is appropriate to complete a PSI or a worksheet without that information, but we can talk offline about that. If anybody has ever dealt with this and they have some secret as to the best way to approach these, that would be great. I'm always about communication, because communicating is what avoids these errors. If you were to say, okay, I'm going to take off these 2 misdemeanors that were listed in the complaint, when in actuality, they had intended to use the felonies that would have left the misdemeanors in, and they would have had a point. So there's a lot that goes into this than just picking a couple. It can affect how many points they have, and I really don't think that it should be on the shoulders of probation to figure this out. And it may come down to having to leave off all of the misdemeanor and gross misdemeanor criminal history because you don't know. And that might not be seen as a reasonable approach to this. I don't know. I'm not in your shoes for probation doing this job. I get to hide behind the manual that just says, well, once you pick them, this is what you do. So anything that I can do to help with maybe opening lines of communication about how we can better handle these, because I know it's going to be an issue when we start talking about out of state. We just need to learn to communicate. I hope it's okay if I read this out loud. I won't attribute it to anyone. A good practice is not submit until your answer is responded to. And if the court questions, you can let them know it was required by the AOs to provide clarification. I think that's a great response. Absolutely great. Here's a question directly related to the policy. Let's say you are doing a worksheet on a felony domestic assault on a person who committed their current offense at age 28. It is my understanding prior juvenile misdemeanor assaults adjudicated delinquent can be used to enhance. Can the juvenile priors here be used to enhance or no, because the person is over age 25? That is such a great question, because that bumps it up against something within the statute and how it compares to the guidelines. So the guidelines say you can't use any of their juvenile offenses if they're 25 or older. So this person is 28, but it also says you can't use anything other than the felonies. So that misdemeanor or gross misdemeanor juvenile that is eligible to be used to enhance under the statute, that wouldn't be eligible to be listed on the worksheet anyway. But it is entirely possible that somebody had a gross misdemeanor DANCO that they committed at age 19 and now they're age 28, and that's within 10 years. So the prosecution can use it to enhance. So whenever we're also looking at that idea, think about the juvenile policy that says, oh, I can't use anything other than felonies. So that's the reason. And then if they're over 28 or over 25 and they used juvenile adjudications for felonies, don't list those on the worksheet either. So that policy is going to govern how it's listed in criminal history, which is a different conversation than what the complaint will say was used to enhance. And I had another response come up that says, in the past, probation just typically used the oldest two offenses. Can we continue to do that? No. Okay, no. I don't think that that is the right approach. This is not the responsibility of probation to choose what has been used to enhance. It should be made clear to probation so that probation can do their job. So I want to circle back to the comment that said, do not include them. And if the court asks questions, let them know that you did not receive the necessary information for criminal history. I thought the out-of-state offense was going to be tough, but these are tough. And I think the thing that we want to remember is if we stay in our lane, they're not too bad. If we always stay in our lane, guidelines are not too bad. It's when people start asking us to drive in other lanes that it gets tough. When they're saying, oh, just pick two. I've heard that before. Just pick two. No, 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 no. So I like the conversation that's happening here, and I want this conversation to trigger conversations within your groups, within your units, your agencies, with your supervisors to go and say, we need to have a meeting with the prosecutor's office and the defense office so that we can come together and talk about these things that need to be dealt with, out of state offenses, enhanced offenses. How do you want us handling these? Because it can't always fall on the shoulders of probation. They have enough on their shoulders, as does everyone else. Those of us that work primarily with the guidelines, though, usually lack a a law degree. And that makes it very difficult for us to do this job because it's outside of our wheelhouse. So keep in mind, when you're doing enhanced offenses, when it's a non-DWI, so we'll say domestics and all the others, when you're using those, every single domestic offense has to be enhanced every time. There's no subsequent felony violent domestic related offenses. So we want to ensure that whenever we are doing a worksheet for someone who is not an enhanced offense, that we are including not only that felony that was enhanced, but the offenses that were used to enhance it, because offenses are only removed from the offense they are enhancing. Misdemeanors and gross misdemeanors are only removed in that single particular situation. Now, they can go back again and enhance something. That's a whole different conversation. This is about make certain that if you have multiple offenses, let's say being sentenced at the same time, you have a domestic offense and you have a drug offense. You're going to leave off the misdemeanors and gross misdemeanors from the domestic, but you're going to put them into the worksheet for the drugs, along with the felony, because the drug offense is not being enhanced. So that is another thing that can sometimes trip people up, is once they're gone, they're gone. Well, not always. So any non-DWIs usually have to be enhanced every time. DWIs don't. Once you have a felony, you always have a felony. So the policy is that the 3 misdemeanors and gross misdemeanors used to enhance the first offense, they're the ones that are gone from any future DWIs. Let's say you had a felony DWI and a fleeing peace officer being sentenced on the same day. It was their subsequent DWI, but everything from the first DWI is not decayed yet. You want to leave those off that subsequent DWI because that's what the policy says. But you would go ahead and include those on the drug offense if they were not decayed. So it's, again, really that idea of just coming in and saying, okay, what type of offense do I have? I have an enhanced offense, so I need to think about 2B.6 as I go through this. He has out-of-state offenses, so I have to think about 2B.5 as I do this. And you sort of just parse it out. And that way, if a theft or a drug offense or something, forgive me, easier lands on your desk, you know that you can just go about business as usual. So these apply only when you're doing these specific types of offenses that are misdemeanor level behavior, that are becoming felonies based on prior criminality. Okay, I'm going to move on But again, do not hesitate to ask any questions. I love the chat. If you don't want me to share it, please write at the beginning, don't share, and I'll just figure out another way to explain it. But let's go on. Oh, everybody always forgets about 2B.7. 2B.7 is the most disrespected policy, only because we ignore it. Because really, the bottom line of 2B.7 is it reminds us that we use the guidelines in effect when the current offense occurs to find the severity level currently assigned to the offense. And that's because elements of the offense may change, the commission may change the severity level ranking, and I have a few examples on there that are really just about updating severity levels from an H to an I or a 2 to a D2. But sitting here, I'm just remembering that possession of a machine gun, the trigger activation, the one that used to be included with the other offenses like tear gas and things, that got pulled out and made its own subdivision, and the commission re-ranked it. So you might be looking at criminal history for somebody who has that machine gun offense from previous times where it was a severity level 3. But if you're doing a worksheet for somebody that committed their offense in 2025, that's now a severity level 8. So that's what 2B.7 is really talking about, is it's not just updating the severity level where it doesn't really affect the points. An H for a failure to register turning into an I doesn't change the points. A 2 turning into a D2 does not change the points. The machine gun going from a 3 to an 8, that changes the points. So just keep in mind that when you're doing the worksheet, that you want to make certain that all of it, not just the points assigned, but the severity level that you put on that worksheet for those priors is also correct. So again, we don't give a lot of love to 2B.7, but I think a lot of it fits in with so much else. You can understand why I forgot it. So let's go. This is what I thought we were going to hit. Using convictions from jurisdictions other than Minnesota in criminal history calculation. 2B.5. We love this, don't we? Okay. Who determines how non-Minnesota offenses are used in criminal history? 2B.5 has a great sentence in it, which says the court must make the final determination as to whether and how a prior non-Minnesota conviction should be counted in criminal history. Period. The court. So I think where sometimes the issue might lie is defining final determination. Does that mean they're going to be the only ones that you give all of the information to the prosecution and the defense? They make their arguments and the court makes the decision. Yeah, but is there an expectation from the prosecution and the defense that probation will provide them information? Usually, probably, and in a lot of cases. So what we want to do when we think about out-of-state offenses is this. From a probation perspective, following the guidelines policies, the court makes the final decision using the nature or definition of that offense from the other state to determine its equivalent here in Minnesota. And in doing that, they follow all of the same policies that we do if the person committed the offense in Minnesota. So there are no different policies applied to out-of-state offenses, except for 2 exceptions to juvenile and federal. But for the most part, we still apply the same policies, period. So it doesn't matter if the person went to prison for 10 years in South Dakota for ingesting a controlled substance. If the court determines that that is not an equitable offense here in Minnesota, it doesn't go on the worksheet. So we want to make certain that we're always leading with what the offense was and then following behind with the sentence. So just a couple of things. I pulled these slides. I decided to pull these slides straight from a presentation that I gave to judges a couple of years ago. And I think that's just because we want to disseminate exactly the same information every time we talk about out-of-state offenses so that it will start to like hammer home the idea of who's responsible for what. So a couple of anomalies now that we want to point out within each of these is that although in Minnesota the felony minimum changed from 366 to 365 for the sentence, the commission kept the out-of-state offenses at 366 days. So someone still has to get a minimum of a year and a day in that other state, or an equivalent of a stay of adjudication, which means when they get 365 days or less, it's still the gross misdemeanor. A federal offense that has no Minnesota equivalent at all, that was sentenced to at least 366 days, that is going to go into criminal history at one point. That's the exception. But remember that the feds have drug offenses, which are usually the most common. So if it can be equated, it should be. And when it's not, that's when it goes in the felony section for 1 point. And please remember that that policy is only for federal offenses. So tribal, military, international still have to follow all the other policies that we have. And if there is no equivalent, there is no counting that in criminal history. And that's the standard across the board. If you can't put that offense in criminal history, you just can't. It doesn't matter if they went to prison. None of that matters. If it's not an offense that they could have been convicted of in Minnesota, it doesn't go in history, period. Which means you can't apply a custody status if you can't also include it as a prior offense. The misdemeanors, those are your targeted misdemeanors. Those are the only ones that are eligible. Remember that if you've got a gross misdemeanor sentenced to 90 days or less, it has to be one of these 8 offenses. That's it in order to count it. Gross misdemeanors, those have to get that 365-day maximum or the equivalent stay of imposition. That equivalent stay of imposition might be slightly difficult sometimes to determine. So I have learned that the term sentence withheld is a different idea than adjudication withheld. We call them a stay of adjudication and a stay of imposition. Stay of adjudication, there's no conviction, there's no sentence. It doesn't count as a prior in criminal history. It may count as a custody status point for that stay of adjudication equivalent sentence, but again, it would have to be an eligible offense, and the court would really be the one that wanted to make that final determination. Versus something that we hear a lot of times out of Wisconsin is sentence withheld. And what we're always looking for when we see that term sentence withheld is, do we have a conviction? not just a guilty plea. The guilty plea is required to include it as custody on a stay of adjudication, but a conviction is required with sentence withheld to include it as an equivalent stay of imposition. So the language is different, but the intent is the same. You're always looking for the conviction and then the sentence that follows. For juvenile offenses, the big one here to remind you of is that they were adjudicated delinquent in juvenile court. They have to follow all the other policies, and other states may do that. But some states take 16-year-olds and put them in adult court for things like felony theft. That cannot come back over here and be used in our criminal history section unless the court says that this person would have been certified as an adult for that offense. So Stay v. Marchetti is that court case. And I believe the idea behind the certification is back in 1982, EJJs were a little less prevalent than they are now. That's not set in stone. That's my conjecture, is that's why it speaks to a certified adult only. But if the court doesn't do that, if they don't say, yeah, they would have been certified as an adult for that theft, so use it in the felony section. If the court makes no determination as to that, leave those juvenile offenses off that were dealt with, adjudicated in adult court. I wanted to give some case law about non-Minnesota offenses and the use of criminal history. And all of these offenses on this page really do stem from this Molly case. And the opinion there was the state's burden to establish a sufficient factual basis for the challenged convictions was neither met nor excused. We reverse and remand for sentencing. So out of that came Gant, Keltner, and Abdullahi. But basically, the state. And since we just sent off our report to the legislature and this information is in that, I can tell you that if it goes through this year's 2026 sentencing guidelines will say the state bears the burden to determine whether or not they count with the court making the final decision. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact language, but the intent is the state bears the burden, the state, not probation. But there are ways that you can help out. So you could try to alert the parties as soon as possible that there is non-Minnesota criminal history present for this person that you're doing this pre-plea, pre-sentence criminal history summary on. Try to give them as much information as you can, at minimum and as available, the statute of the conviction offense and the duration of the imposed sentence. And I think the reason why giving them the statute is helpful because it's not too difficult to find. Thanks to the Google, you can Google ingestion of a controlled substance in South Dakota, and it will give you the statute number. And it will probably even give you an overview of what you have to do to get convicted of that offense. I have found lovely defense attorney websites that explain in very good detail what someone has to do to be convicted of a crime. Not from a defense attorney angle, but from a factual angle based on the statute. So the Google is very helpful. Remembering that the sentence is important. 365 days unless that's your gross misdemeanor, 366 for your felony. But the sentence is not the leading consideration. The sentence should not ever be thought of as where something or something is eligible because they went to prison. No. Something is eligible because it equates to an offense that we have here in Minnesota, and their sentence was at least 366 days for a felony, or their sentence was 365 days for a gross misdemeanor. If something equates to a Minnesota gross misdemeanor, but they went to prison in the other state, it still goes in the gross misdemeanor criminal history section, because we always want to lead with what it equates to and then use the sentence to determine where it goes. Because if it doesn't equate to anything, it doesn't go anywhere. When there is no data available, when the other state is charging you for copies, I kind of feel like it would be really good to note that in your report. But as sort of I don't want to call it an olive branch, but as a means of saying, okay, here are all the ones we can't do, but here's a drug offense where he possessed 30 grams of cocaine. It appears this would equate to I'm going to call it a first degree because I don't have it in front of me. This equates to a first degree in Minnesota. The court will still need to make those final decisions, but you can help them out a little bit when you have a threshold offense. When we know you have to possess this much drug, or your monetary amount needs to be between these two amounts of money. Wow, I can't think. If somebody says, well, that offense, they could be convicted of it if they had less than $10,000. Well, less than $10,000 can be $1. So remember that in Minnesota, we use these minimum thresholds. So it may fit within a minimum threshold here. Enhanced offenses, we look at the statute, it takes 2, it takes 3 DWIs. That's the big one. 3 DWIs, their fourth one is the felony. Count their priors. If they have 3 priors, you can say this would be a felony based on X, Y, and Z. As much information as you can provide without making the final decision is the appropriate step, I think, for probation to make. And then finally, if you can include on your sentencing worksheet, the court made the decision on the inclusion of non-Minnesota priors per 2B.5. And that tells us that everything was followed up with and that they did. But when we see out-of-state offenses that are not even giving us what the Minnesota equivalent is, and they definitely don't tell us the court said it was good, we're going to send those back because MSGC staff cannot sign off on something that does not meet the policies. And that's what our role is in reviewing worksheets, is ensuring that the policies are followed. So help us by indicating that, in fact, the court made the final decision. If you have to write on there, the court will need to make the final decision. Add a statement that says any removal of these priors will affect criminal history. Any change to these priors may affect criminal history and the presumptive sentence. 2B.5 is one of those sections where I don't mind helping you out because I know we are covered by that. Court makes the final decision, but that's not always easy for those of you that are out there in the probation world. And so anything that we can do to help you with that, even if it's formulating a statement to write under what the guidelines say, we're here to help. That brings us to the end. I hope this was okay. This is the one that what I said was really tough, and I'm really hoping that it gave you that high level information, at least that will be helpful. And then, of course, as you know, you can reach out to us anytime by email or by phone for any assistance. But one thing that we can't do is tell you what was used to enhance or what to use to enhance or what the out of state equivalent is. So with that in mind, I'm happy to stay for as long as you need me to if people want to talk, but otherwise, I thank you so much for attending this January 2026 Lunch and Learn. And next month, we will be doing the presumptive sentence, section 2C of the guidelines. So we're out of criminal history and we're into the actual sentence. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Linda. You did great. Appreciate you. And again, like she said, if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask that question if you have it. Or also you could email us if you don't have the time. I know it's lunch break.
Yes, thank you for spending your lunch with us. I really appreciate that. All right. Well, I think we can end it here. Thanks so much. And thank you again to Devontae for making these happen. I really appreciate that. And I will say that every time.
Making me blush. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody. See you next time.